The man they convicted without proof. Before we dive into the most disturbing miscarriages of justice you'll ever hear, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Click the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. And please, share this video because what happened to the man in today's story could happen to anyone. Anyone at all. Now, let me tell you about Marcus Holloway. A name that should mean nothing to you. A name that, by all accounts, should have remained in obscurity, attached to a man living a quiet, unremarkable life in a small town called Millbrook Valley. But instead, Marcus Holloway became synonymous with one of the most controversial convictions in modern legal history. A conviction built not on evidence, but on fear. Not on proof, but on assumption. Not on truth, but on the terrible, crushing weight of circumstance. This is the story of how the system failed. How a community turned against one of its own. And how a man's life was destroyed by something as intangible as suspicion. Marcus Holloway was 34 years old when his life ended. Not literally, you understand. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept drawing breath. But the life he knew, the life he'd built with careful, deliberate precision over 3 decades, came to an abrupt and violent halt on a Tuesday morning in October. But let's go back. Let's go back to before. Because to understand what was taken from Marcus, you need to know what he had. What he was. Marcus grew up in Millbrook Valley, a town of roughly 8,000 people nestled in the valley between 2 mountain ranges. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Where your reputation is built over decades, not days. Where a handshake still means something, and where your family name carries weight, for better or worse. The Holloways weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. Marcus's father, Robert, worked at the lumber mill on the east side of town. His mother, Diana, was a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Street, with a lawn Marcus mowed every Saturday and a garage where Robert taught his son how to change oil, replace brake pads, and understand that a man who can fix things with his own hands is a man who'll never be helpless. Marcus was an average student. Not the valedictorian, but not struggling either. He played baseball in high school, pitched for the junior varsity team, made varsity his senior year but spent most games on the bench. He had friends, the way everyone in a small town has friends. People he'd known since kindergarten. People who knew his parents, his grandparents, his entire family tree. After graduation, Marcus didn't leave for college like some of his classmates. He got a job at the same lumber mill where his father worked. Started in the yard, moving stock, loading trucks, learning the trade from the ground up. Within 5 years, he'd moved up to machine operator. Within 10, he was a shift supervisor. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. It paid the bills. It gave him purpose. When Marcus was 28, he met Elizabeth Chen at a community barbecue. She'd moved to Millbrook Valley to work as a teacher at the elementary school. They dated for 2 years before Marcus proposed. They married in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church, the same church where 3 generations of Holloways had been married. They bought a house. Not the house Marcus grew up in, but one like it, on the other side of town, on Magnolia Drive. They talked about having children. They talked about growing old together. This was Marcus Holloway's life. Unremarkable. Predictable. Safe. And then, on a Wednesday evening in September, everything changed. Emma Pritchard was 7 years old. She had blonde hair that her mother kept in 2 braids, and she wore glasses with purple frames that she'd picked out herself. She liked strawberry ice cream and hated broccoli. She was learning to play the piano. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up because she loved animals, especially the family's golden retriever, Biscuit. Emma Pritchard disappeared on a Wednesday evening while riding her bicycle 3 blocks from her home. Her mother, Jennifer Pritchard, had sent Emma to return a casserole dish to their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. It was a trip Emma had made dozens of times before. 3 blocks. Turn left on Oak Street, then right on Birch, straight to Mrs. Patterson's house. 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back. But Emma never arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house. And she never came home. Jennifer Pritchard called the police at 6:47 p.m. By 7:15, half the town was searching. Volunteers combed through yards, parks, the woods at the edge of town. They called Emma's name until their voices were hoarse. They knocked on every door. They checked every garage, every shed, every possible place a 7-year-old girl might be. Emma's bicycle was found the next morning in a drainage ditch off Highway 12, roughly 4 miles from where she was last seen. The purple basket on the front handlebars was still intact. The casserole dish was gone. The search intensified. The FBI was called in. Bloodhounds tracked scents that went nowhere. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the surrounding forests. The news media descended on Millbrook Valley like locusts, setting up satellite trucks in the town square, interviewing anyone who'd speak to them. Days became weeks. Hope began to curdle into desperation, and desperation into something darker. Something more primal. Fear. Multiple witnesses confirmed they'd seen Marcus's truck on Oak Street around the time Emma disappeared. Marcus himself admitted it when questioned. Why wouldn't he? He had nothing to hide. He'd driven past a child on a bicycle. That wasn't a crime. That was a coincidence. But in Millbrook Valley, in the fevered atmosphere of fear and grief that had consumed the town, coincidence became causation. Presence became guilt. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time became proof of the worst possible crime. The police questioned Marcus repeatedly. They asked him to account for his movements that evening. He told them the truth. He'd driven home from work. He'd stopped at the gas station on Highway 12 to fill up his tank. He'd arrived home around 6:30. His wife Elizabeth confirmed this. The timestamp on his credit card receipt from the gas station confirmed this. But the gas station was on Highway 12, the same highway where Emma's bicycle was found. This, the police decided, was significant. They obtained a warrant to search Marcus's home, his vehicles, his property. They tore through his house, looking for any shred of evidence, any trace of Emma Pritchard, any indication that Marcus Holloway was the monster they needed him to be. They found nothing. No DNA. No fibers. No blood. No sign that Emma had ever been in Marcus's home or vehicles. Nothing. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The suspicion had been planted. And in a town desperate for answers, desperate to believe that the person who took Emma had been caught, desperate to sleep safely again, Marcus Holloway became the answer they needed. The district attorney's name was Raymond Fletcher. He'd been the DA for Millbrook County for 12 years. He'd prosecuted drunk drivers, domestic abusers, drug dealers, and thieves. He'd won most of his cases. He had political ambitions. He wanted to run for state attorney general. He needed a conviction in the Emma Pritchard case. He needed it badly. The problem was, he had no evidence. So Raymond Fletcher did what prosecutors sometimes do when they have no evidence. He built a case out of air. Out of supposition. Out of carefully constructed narrative that turned innocent actions into sinister behavior. Marcus Holloway was charged with kidnapping and suspected murder, even though Emma's body had never been found. Even though there was no physical evidence linking Marcus to the crime. Even though his alibi, while not airtight, was consistent and corroborated. The prosecution, in their closing argument, said something that still echoes in my mind. Raymond Fletcher stood before the jury and said, "We may not have Emma Pritchard's body. We may not have a confession. But we have the truth. And the truth is sitting right there." He pointed at Marcus. The truth is that a child disappeared, and this man was there. This man had the opportunity. This man had the means. And now, you have the power to give Emma justice. You have the power to protect this community. You have the power to make sure this never happens again. Notice what's missing from that statement? Evidence. Proof. Facts. The jury deliberated for 16 hours. When they came back, the forewoman wouldn't look at Marcus. That's when he knew. Guilty on all counts. Marcus Holloway stood as the verdict was read. His wife Elizabeth collapsed in the gallery, sobbing. His mother Diana clutched her chest and had to be helped from the courtroom. His father Robert sat motionless, his face the color of ash. Marcus was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. For a crime the prosecution couldn't prove he committed. For a crime with no physical evidence linking him to the victim. For a crime he may very well not have committed at all. Prison is a brutal place for anyone. But for someone convicted of crimes against a child, it's hell on earth. Marcus Holloway entered the state penitentiary at Coldwater 3 weeks after his sentencing. He'd lost 30 pounds during the trial. He would lose 30 more in the first year of his incarceration. In prison, Marcus was marked. Everyone knew what he'd been convicted of. In the hierarchy of inmates, he was at the absolute bottom. Child predators are despised even by other criminals. Marcus was beaten 7 times in his first 6 months. His nose was broken. 3 ribs were cracked. He was stabbed in the shoulder with a sharpened toothbrush. Prison guards, who are supposed to protect all inmates regardless of their crimes, sometimes looked the other way. Sometimes they were slow to respond. Sometimes they just didn't care. Marcus spent 23 hours a day in his cell for his own protection. 1 hour for exercise, alone in a concrete yard surrounded by 20-foot walls. This was his life. This was his future. Decades of isolation, violence, and hopelessness. But let me tell you what was happening outside those prison walls. Let me tell you what was happening in Millbrook Valley. Elizabeth Holloway stood by her husband. She visited him every week the prison allowed. She wrote letters. She hired a new attorney to file appeals. She spent every penny of their savings, then remortgaged their house, then took out loans. She believed in Marcus's innocence with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Because she knew him. She knew the man she'd married. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was not capable of harming a child. But Elizabeth paid a price for her loyalty. She was ostracized in Millbrook Valley. Parents at the school where she taught demanded she be fired. They didn't want their children taught by the wife of a child predator. The school board held an emergency meeting. They couldn't legally fire her without cause, but they made it clear she wasn't welcome. Elizabeth resigned. She had no choice. She couldn't find work anywhere in Millbrook Valley. Her friends stopped calling. Her neighbors stopped speaking to her. Someone spray-painted "Monster's Wife" across her garage door. Someone slashed her tires. Someone threw a brick through her living room window with a note attached, "Leave or we'll make you." Elizabeth Holloway left Millbrook Valley 14 months after Marcus was convicted. She moved 300 miles away to a city where no one knew her name. Where no one knew her story. Where she could try to rebuild something resembling a life while fighting for her husband's freedom. Marcus's parents stayed in Millbrook Valley. Robert Holloway continued working at the lumber mill, but he was moved to a different shift. His co-workers didn't want to work alongside the father of a child killer. He ate lunch alone. He worked in silence. Diana Holloway stopped going to church. She couldn't bear the stares, the whispers, the way people she'd known for decades crossed the street to avoid her. Both of them aged 20 years in the span of 2. Robert's hair went completely white. Diana developed a tremor in her hands that doctors attributed to stress. They visited Marcus when they could, but each visit broke them a little more. Seeing their son in prison, knowing he was innocent, knowing they were powerless to help him, it was a special kind of torture. Meanwhile, in that same community, Emma Pritchard's parents were no closer to closure. Yes, someone had been convicted. Yes, someone was in prison. But Emma was still gone. They still didn't know what happened to their daughter. They still didn't have a body to bury. They still didn't have answers. Jennifer Pritchard, in a moment of vulnerability during a television interview 3 years after the trial, said something profound. She said, "They tell us justice was served. They tell us the man who took Emma is behind bars. But I don't feel justice. I don't feel anything except empty." My daughter is still gone. And I still don't know why. I still don't know how. I don't even know if that man really did it. I just know my baby is gone. This is what happens when the system prioritizes convictions over truth. Nobody wins. The innocent go to prison. The guilty remain free. The victims remain without answers. And an entire community remains traumatized. The appeals process is long and complicated. Marcus's new attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance who took the case pro bono after reading about it, filed multiple appeals. She challenged the lack of evidence. She challenged the admissibility of the behavioral analysis testimony. She challenged the prosecution's failure to disclose certain information to the defense. She argued that Marcus's constitutional rights had been violated. Every appeal was denied. The appellate courts upheld the conviction. The reasoning was always the same. The jury had heard the evidence and reached a verdict. Absent some extraordinary new evidence, the conviction would stand. It didn't matter that the evidence was weak. It didn't matter that reasonable doubt should have prevailed. The jury had spoken, and that was the end of it. Years passed. Marcus turned 40 in prison. Then 45. He'd been incarcerated for a decade. A decade of his life gone. A decade of isolation, violence, and despair. A decade of maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen, and almost no one would listen. But then, something happened. Something that would change everything. Not because the system suddenly started working. Not because justice finally prevailed. But because of something no one could have predicted. 11 years after Emma Pritchard disappeared, a construction crew was demolishing an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Riverbend, a town 40 miles from Millbrook Valley. The warehouse had been empty for 15 years, owned by a company that went bankrupt and left the building to decay. During the demolition, workers found a hidden room in the basement. A room that didn't appear on any of the building's blueprints. A room with a reinforced door and no windows. A room that, when opened, revealed something that would shock the entire region. Inside that room, police found the remains of 3 children. 3 missing children from 3 different towns over the span of a decade. The remains were in various states of decomposition, but forensic analysis would later identify them using dental records and DNA. One of those children was Emma Pritchard. Also found in that room was a journal. A detailed, handwritten journal kept by a man named Carl Dietrich. Carl Dietrich had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the warehouse before the company went bankrupt. He'd had access to the building even after it closed. He'd created his hidden room and used it for a purpose so dark I can barely bring myself to describe it. The journal contained detailed entries about each of his victims. Where he'd found them. How he'd taken them. What he'd done to them. It was the confession of a serial predator, written in his own hand, describing crimes that spanned over a decade. Carl Dietrich had died 7 months before the warehouse was demolished. He'd been killed in a car accident on a rural highway, driving drunk, colliding with a tree at 80 miles per hour. He died instantly. He took his secrets with him. Or he thought he did. The journal entry about Emma Pritchard was detailed. Carl Dietrich had been driving through Millbrook Valley on his way to visit his sister. He'd seen Emma riding her bicycle. He'd followed her. He'd offered her a ride, told her that her mother had sent him, that there was an emergency. Emma, trusting the way 7-year-olds trust adults, had believed him. She'd gotten into his car. He'd taken her to the warehouse. She'd never left. Emma's bicycle, Carl Dietrich wrote, he'd disposed of on his way back to Riverbend. He'd tossed it in a drainage ditch off Highway 12. Random chance. Random location. It had nothing to do with Marcus Holloway or the gas station or any of the narrative the prosecution had constructed. The news broke like a thunderclap. The FBI confirmed the authenticity of the journal. The remains were positively identified. Carl Dietrich was definitively linked to Emma's death. And Marcus Holloway, who'd spent 11 years in prison, was innocent. Marcus was released 6 weeks after the discovery. 6 weeks of bureaucratic processing, of legal formalities, of the slow grinding gears of a system that had moved so quickly to convict him and now moved at a crawl to free him. The day Marcus walked out of Coldwater State Penitentiary, he was 45 years old. He'd entered prison at 34. He'd lost 11 years. 11 years of his life. His marriage, though Elizabeth had never divorced him, was strained beyond recognition. His parents were elderly and broken. His reputation was destroyed. His career was over. His health, both physical and mental, was shattered. The district attorney who prosecuted him, Raymond Fletcher, had been elected state attorney general 8 years earlier. He released a statement saying he regretted the outcome but that he'd prosecuted the case in good faith based on the evidence available at the time. He offered no apology. He faced no consequences for putting an innocent man in prison. The jurors who convicted Marcus, when contacted by reporters, had varying responses. Some expressed remorse. Some said they'd done their duty based on the evidence presented. Some refused to comment. Some still believed they'd made the right decision at the time, that they couldn't have known what they didn't know. The town of Millbrook Valley was left to grapple with what they'd done. How they'd turned on one of their own. How they'd been so desperate for answers that they'd accepted a false truth. How their fear had made them complicit in destroying an innocent man's life. Some people apologized to Marcus. Some people pretended it never happened. Some people still avoided him, still looked at him with suspicion, because once someone is labeled a monster, that label doesn't wash off easily. It sticks. It stains. Marcus received financial compensation from the state. It's called wrongful conviction compensation. The amount varies by state, but typically it's somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 per year of wrongful incarceration. Marcus received approximately $800,000. $800,000 for 11 years of hell. $800,000 that couldn't give him back his life, his health, his reputation, his lost years. Marcus and Elizabeth tried to reconcile. They tried to rebuild what they'd had. But 11 years of separation, of trauma, of fighting a losing battle against the system, had changed them both irrevocably. They divorced quietly 2 years after his release. It was amicable. They still cared for each other. But some things, once broken, can't be fully repaired. Marcus tried to reintegrate into society. He tried to find work. But no one wants to hire a man who spent 11 years in prison, even if he was exonerated. His Google search results still showed news articles about his conviction. Yes, there were articles about his exoneration too, but the damage was done. Employers saw the conviction. They saw the crime he'd been accused of. And they moved on to the next applicant. Marcus developed PTSD from his time in prison. He suffered from nightmares, panic attacks, severe anxiety. He couldn't be in crowded places. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being in danger. Prison had fundamentally altered his brain chemistry, his psychology, his ability to function in the world. The last I heard about Marcus Holloway, he was living alone in a small apartment in a city far from Millbrook Valley. He sees a therapist twice a week. He volunteers at an organization that advocates for criminal justice reform. He tells his story to anyone who will listen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it will prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. But Marcus knows the truth. It will happen again. It's happening right now. Somewhere in this country, someone is being prosecuted for a crime they didn't commit. Somewhere, a jury is convicting someone based on weak evidence and strong emotions. Somewhere, an innocent person is beginning what might be decades behind bars. Before you leave today, I want you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Second, click that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And third, share this video. Share Marcus's story. Because the more people who understand how the system can fail, the more people who demand reform, the better chance we have of preventing this from happening to someone else.